He believed he would be protected by his authority. No one would question him, he believed. However, his rule ended abruptly when Pam Bondi revealed his covert transactions. Pam Bondi has previously dealt with difficult issues. She had fought against drug cartels, crooked politicians, and prominent criminals who believed they were beyond the law in her previous role as Florida's Attorney General. However, this instance was unique. She sat at her desk and flipped through the huge file in front of her, which included sworn affidavits, financial documents, and transcripts of depositions. It became worse the farther she read. At the heart of it all was a judge, a person who had taken an oath to enforce the rule of law. For more than 20 years, Judge Robert Kinsey has served on the bench, overseeing cases that had a significant impact on thousands of people's lives. At least on paper, his reputation was immaculate and his record was impeccable. However, Bondi was aware that looks were not always reliable. Her client, Kyle Donahue, sat rigidly in his chair across from her. He was a former courtroom clerk who had discovered something that most people would have ignored. Not Kyle, however. Despite the consequences to his career and personal safety, he had gone out with what he knew. Are you implying that Kinsey solved cases for years without anybody noticing? Bondi's voice was harsh yet steady as she questioned. Kyle rubbed his palms together and let out a breath. Not quite. People took notice. However, they ignored it. He was cautious, never accepted money directly, and never moved without hiding his identity. However, I saw things like case files going missing, illogical judgments, and decisions that repeatedly benefited the same select few. Bondi examined him. There weren't many whistleblowers. Even unusual are those who have progressed this far. She responded, "Give me specifics." Kyle gave a nod. Consider Daniel Reyes, a developer who was involved in a real estate scam the previous year. He ought to have been imprisoned for deception. Pam, millions of money. However, Kinsey tossed out important evidence, saying it was handled improperly. The next thing you know, Reyes is on his own. It wasn't a coincidence. Bondi turned to the part of the document that described Reyes's situation. At best, the judge's justification for rejecting the evidence was weak. At worst, outright corrupt. That wasn't all, however. It was one of many of similar situations. A business leader is charged with insider trading. An unexpected lack of evidence led to the charges being withdrawn. An influential entrepreneur with connections to offshore accounts. On a technicality, the case was dismissed. A jury found a well-known money launderer guilty. Citing inadequate jury instruction, Kinsey reversed the judgment. There was a pattern, and the judge was in the center of it. What about the cash? Somewhere it was coming from. Bondi raised his head. What financial information do you have? Kyle paused. It becomes complicated at that point. He has spotless official records. No significant deposits or abrupt lifestyle adjustments. However, I discovered something. Real estate holdings and offshore accounts under many identities. He stopped, now speaking in a softer tone. I believe that he is being shielded. Bondi's gaze became strained. Who did it? Kyle gave a headshake. I'm not sure yet, but the names are there if you look closely enough. Pam Bondi reclined in her seat. She had previously faced corruption, but this was significant. There was more than one guy misusing his position of authority. The purpose of this method was to suppress anyone who approached too closely and to protect the guilty. She had a gut feeling. There would be no peaceful death for Judge Kinsey if they were correct. However, she had no fear of conflict. And she had a feeling that this was just the beginning. Pam Bondi was aware that establishing guilt was not the only goal in exposing a dishonest judge. It was about surviving the accompanying battle. She was sitting in her vehicle, which was parked a block from the Hillsborough County Courthouse. She wasn't paying attention to the Florida heat that was pressing on the windows. Judge Robert Kinsey went about his business as usual inside the building, his black robe protecting him from suspicion. Her cell rang. Mark Henshaw, detective. She responded right away. Tell me you discovered anything. He spoke in a quiet, wary tone. You're not going to like this, Bondi. Give me a try. A pause occurred. Kyle was correct. Kinsey's assets are concealed beneath fictitious companies. We were able to link 3 different shell corporations to Cayman Islands offshore accounts. They are all related to cases that he decided. Each and every one of them is helping a well-known defendant. Bondi gripped the driving wheel tighter. This kind of corruption was nothing new to her. Layers of fictitious companies are used to move money in order to conceal the true participants. Kinsey, however, had exercised caution. Too cautious. This is sufficient to initiate an inquiry, she said. We have him if we can directly link one of those transactions to a decision. Henshaw let out a breath. There's more. Bondi felt nauseous. Proceed. According to one of our sources, Kinsey is aware that he is being observed. He began transferring funds. He's preparing to run. A glimmer of pleasure passed through Bondi. The pressure was effective. That meant something different, however. Kinsey was not going down easily. After hanging up, she went to the passenger seat and took her case file. The next step has to be taken. With her heels tapping on the marble flooring, Bondi walked confidently across the courtroom lobby. The fragrance of ancient wood and paper filled the place. Similar to a decision-making location. Lives were transformed. She had been in courtrooms like this for years, seeing how the system functions as intended. This time, however, the issue was with the system. Outside Kinsey's courtroom, Kyle was waiting for her, his anxious gaze flitting to the doors. He said, "You're really doing this?" Bondi gave a nod. "There is nothing we can do." Judge Kinsey sat at the bench inside, overseeing a trial that was still in progress. He had an inscrutable face, the very appearance of authority. Bondi, however, had seen enough to know the reality. She sat close to the rear and observed his every action. The trial went on. A straightforward disagreement about a contract. Her thoughts, however, were elsewhere. It was Kinsey's voice. When he made a decision, he leaned forward. The way he pretended to be objective. Everything was a performance. And she was going to rip it to pieces. She took action as soon as the trial was postponed for recess. She said, "Your Honor," and strode up to the bench. "Take a minute." Kinsey glanced up, obviously annoyed. "I didn't know you were involved in these procedures, Ms. Bondi." "I'm not," she replied. "However, I think we have some unresolved business." Slowly, the courtroom began to empty. Lawyers compiling their documents. Clerks shifting from one seat to another. Bondi, however, refused to move. With a groan, Kinsey got from the bench and his voice trailed off. "Don't waste your breath if you're here to discuss your whistleblower's crap. Nothing is yours." Bondi grinned. "We'll investigate it." She gave him a folder made of manila. Financial documentation. Accounts that are offshore. Business relationships. "Judge, you've been careless." Bondi saw it, but Kinsey's face remained unchanged. Something flickered behind his eyes. A split in the mask. He scanned the pages of the folder as he opened it. Then he shut it. "This is meaningless." "Not yet," answered Bondi. "However, it will." She turned and left. However, Kinsey's voice interrupted her before she could get to the door. "Pam, you're making a mistake." She glanced over her shoulder again. "Not at all, Robert. You did." The world was about to learn the truth. Threats were nothing new to Pam Bondi. The job came with them. However, the manner in which Judge Robert Kinsey had said it. "Pam, you're doing something wrong." It wasn't only a warning. It was difficult. Taking her phone out of her pocket, she left the courthouse and stepped out into the muggy Florida day. She made no hesitation. "I need to see you, Detective Henshaw. Right now." Bondi sat beside Henshaw at a tiny, dark cafe on the outskirts of town half an hour later. They weren't here for the meal, but the coffee was awful. Between them, Henshaw set a pile of papers. "We pulled all of this in the last 24 hours. Kinsey's front businesses. They have ties to some really influential persons." Bondi leafed over the papers. She knew the names. CEOs, developers, and even elected officials. Transactions were the only subject of several of Kinsey's most significant rulings. For sale, verdicts. She said, "He's not working alone." Henshaw bent closer. "I'm attempting to convey it to you. Millions of dollars are being laundered via phony companies and transferred through offshore accounts. Criminals were meant to be imprisoned for life in several of these instances. Kinsey let them walk instead." Bondi's jaw tightened. It was one thing to have a crooked judge. It was quite another to have a network guard him. However, there was a more urgent matter. She responded, "You said he's moving money." "Where?" Henshaw paused. "That's the issue. He's hiding his identity. Over the last week, several offshore accounts have been depleted. We're running out of time if he intends to run." Pam shoved the papers away. This case had just become larger than she had anticipated. "Then we had him hold his hand." Bondi summoned Kyle Donahue back in her office. He responded right away. "She said you were correct. Kinsey is not the only one. He is a component of a larger whole." On the other end, Kyle let out a breath. "I warned you, and you are aware of the risk if you were seeing what I saw." Bondi reclined in her seat. "I need more. Anything that immediately links him to a bribe." Kyle paused. "One thing, but it's dangerous." Bondi did not flinch. "Proceed." Natalie Briggs, a former clerk in the courtroom. She spent years working in Kinsey's chambers. A few months ago, she abruptly departed. "I heard she had information on him, but no one knows why." Pam drummed her fingers on her desk. "Now, where is she?" Kyle spoke more quietly. She is not making much of an impression. She probably doesn't want to be discovered. Bondi's thoughts were already racing. Natalie knew things if she had worked closely with Kinsey. Things that could reveal the truth about this case. I need an address. Kyle let out a sigh. Let me see what I can do. But watch out, Bondi. Kinsey won't be the only one who wants to keep her silent if she gets evidence. Bondi followed the location Kyle had located to a little one-story home outside of Tampa. The porch light flickered dimly in the overgrown front yard. Twice she knocked. No response. She pounded louder this time. Briggs, Natalie? Pam Bondi is my name. I must speak with you. The door just cracked open. A woman's face emerged with weary eyes and a cautious look. Leave. Bondi remained still. I am aware that you were employed by Judge Kinsey. I am aware of your abrupt departure. I believe I understand why. Natalie's hand gripped the door more firmly. I have no idea what you're discussing. Bondi responded, yes, you do, in a calmer tone. You've been carrying this alone for too long, in my opinion. Natalie paused. She sighed and opened the door. Enter. But you were never here, in case anybody is curious. At that moment, Bondi realized she was about to discover something that would completely alter her life. A sense of uneasiness pervaded Natalie Briggs' home. With the curtains shut and just one bulb in the corner, the room was dark. Near the entrance, half-packed boxes stood as if she were prepared to go at any time. Pam Bondi in slowly, observing Natalie's every action. The lady felt anxious, not just scared, but also pursued. Natalie gestured to a shabby sofa and said, sit. After saying what has to be said, go away. With her hands on her knees, Bondi sat and spoke steadily. You spent years working for Judge Kinsey. She learned stuff from you. You're knowledgeable. Natalie chuckled dryly. Do you think I'm unaware of that? Do you really believe that I don't wake up every day feeling guilty about what I saw and didn't notice? Pam leaned a little forward. Then share your knowledge with me. Natalie let out a quick exhale and folded her arms. The unofficial books were mine. The ones that were never recorded in the courtroom. I saw how the money arrived, where it went, and who profited. Even though I knew it was bad, you convince yourself it's not your issue when you're involved and it's your livelihood. Bondi did not recoil. She was used to hearing explanations. However, Bondi saw that Natalie's voice broke at the last phrase. The burden she'd been bearing. Natalie went on, I wanted out. I informed Kinsey that I was finished and would no longer be involved. And what did he do, do you know? Bondi waited. Natalie lowered her voice to a whisper. He grinned. People who leave me don't last long, Natalie, he remarked. Before you commit a mistake, consider that. Bondi's stomach twisted. Natalie then cleaned her face with her hand. My home was broken into a week later. It was demolished, nothing taken. My tires cut. My feline vanished. An unspoken communication. Pam's jaw tightened. Kinsey was more than simply a dishonest jurist. He was a bully who kept people in line by instilling fear. Natalie got up and vanished into the next room. Upon her return, she was holding a little flash drive in her fingers. You're looking for this, she said. Natalie drew back as Pam went for it. Pay attention to me. You have to complete what I began if you accept this. You must ensure that this guy never again dons a robe. Pam stared. I worked twice, I swear. After a moment of hesitation, Natalie picked up the drive. It has everything. Case notes, talks, and transactions. Sufficient to bury him. Pam wrapped it in her fingers. Then I'll do just that. However, she got the uneasy impression that Kinsey already knew she was going after him as she made her way to the door. Sitting in her office, Pam Bondi gazed at the flash drive she was holding. Despite its modest size and lack of distinction, the weight of its contents was enormous. She had just received the key to exposing Judge Robert Kinsey from Natalie Briggs. Evidence. Unquestionable, hard evidence of his corruption. Accounts that are offshore. Transfers by wire. Notes on cases. Transcripts of discussions that ought never to have been recorded. She connected her laptop to the disk. The files opened immediately. The screen is filled with rows of data. Then she noticed it. A 3-year-old transaction log. There is a name connected. The real estate developer Daniel Reyes was exonerated of fraud charges. Kinsey had dismissed the case on a technicality. Pam's heartbeat accelerated. One more entry. An alternative name. Hedge fund manager Lewis Carver's insider trading lawsuit had inexplicably fallen through in court. Everything was present. Kinsey had touched every case. Each and every payout. He had sold every choice he made. Her thoughts were racing. Kinsey couldn't have done this by herself. Far too many had turned a blind eye. But she only had one job at the moment. Take him out. Reaching for her phone, she called Detective Henshaw. I've got what we need, she stated steadily. Tomorrow morning, come see me at the courthouse. Henshaw made no mistake. It's taking place. It's taking place. Bondi entered the Hillsborough County Courthouse the next morning. Every stride she took was measured. Kinsey would see her, she knew. She desired that he do so. She walked through the hallways. Former lawyers and clerks who were unaware that all would alter in a matter of hours. State versus Simon Caldwell was in progress inside courtroom 3B. An instance of corporate fraud. Kinsey would probably rig this one as well in order to shield the guilty. Pam sat down close to the front. Wearing black robes, Judge Kinsey sat at the bench with the same composed authority that he usually had. He didn't show it if he sensed the walls closing in. Bondi stood when the prosecutor was in the middle of speaking. Your Honor, she murmured. Kinsey jerked her head up. You are not counsel in this case, Ms. Bondi. She pulled a big file from her purse and interrupted, saying, sit down or I have urgent business before the court. There was silence in the room. Kinsey's mouth clenched. You're not in line. Bondi remained still. You have betrayed the confidence of this court, the people of Florida, and the fundamental basis of justice itself, Robert Kinsey. The courtroom echoed with a whisper. Kinsey gripped his gavel more tightly. This is ridiculous, he yelled. Bailiff. The courtroom's rear doors, however, flew open. 2 federal agents and Detective Henshaw came in. Putting the flash disk on the clerk's desk, Pam moved ahead. Records of illicit transactions, offshore accounts, and case manipulation over the last 10 years are on this disk. Every decision you made was purchased and funded. Kinsey's face became white. This is an unfounded assault. Henshaw responded, Your Honor, and moved ahead. We have an arrest warrant for you. There was a gasp in the room. Kinsey's hands tightened into fists, and Pam stared. He sensed that his world was falling apart. Do you believe this will last? His voice was low as he spit. Do you believe I'll be manipulated by the system? Pam looked up at him. It has already. The bailiff moved to the front. Kinsey was suddenly facing opposition from the same courtroom he had dominated for years. Finally, Pam Bondi saw the truth in his eyes as the shackles tightened around his wrists. Fear. She wasn't finished yet, however. The courtroom was oppressively tense. The man who had ruled over innumerable lives, Judge Robert Kinsey, now stood still as U.S. Marshals wrapped his wrists in the icy steel of handcuffs. He remained still for a minute. Didn't say anything. Everyone in the room felt the weight of his demise as the stillness dragged on. Then he carefully looked in Pam Bondi's direction. He snarled, his voice low and controlled, this is a mistake. However, Bondi heard terror underlying it. She didn't recoil. No, it's justice, Robert. It shook the courtroom. As the once dominant judge was brought away from the bench he had sat on for decades, everyone, attorneys, clerks, reporters, either watched in startled silence or whispered in disbelief. Bondi saw something evil spark in Kinsey's eyes as he passed. It's a warning, not simply rage. It's not over yet. Bondi left the courtroom and stepped outside into the blazing Florida heat. Reporters rushed for remarks as news vehicles packed the roadway. She continued. Detective Henshaw, however, fell into step next to her before she could get to her vehicle. Well, that was something, he remarked, letting out a breath. Bondi continued to move. It's not finished yet. Henshaw gave a nod. You're correct. Kinsey is just the beginning of this chaos. The links, the money trail. This is far more than him. Bondi paused and looked up at him. We don't stop here, then? Henshaw took a time to examine her. Are you certain you're prepared for that? She considered Kyle Donahue, Natalie Briggs, and all the cases Kinsey had tainted. Everyone who suffered as a result of one man's decision that his power was more valuable than their lives. She looked directly at Henshaw. If I wasn't, I wouldn't be here. Kinsey sat in an interview room at the Tampa Federal Detention Center 3 days later. He was wearing a beige prison uniform instead of his suit. He seemed older and smaller now. On the opposite side of the glass, Pam Bondi watched. Henshaw came over. He's speaking. She arched an eyebrow. The investigator gave a nod. Not all of it yet, but enough to frighten some people. Bondi folded her arms. He's negotiating. In an attempt, Henshaw said. Backroom meetings, deals, and names. That's just what we believed. He was more than simply filthy. He belonged to a machine. Bondi's gaze remained fixed. Then we rip it to pieces. As if he could sense her presence behind the glass, Kinsey moved his head slightly. He wasn't the one making the judgment for the first time in his life. Not all corruption is audible. It doesn't always flash lights or sirens to warn people about it. It may sometimes be concealed by a judge's voice, a penstroke, or the weight of a gavel. However, justice, true justice, finds a way. Pam Bondi had seen the systems break down. She has seen individuals take advantage of the law. However, she had also seen what occurs when the proper people don't give up. And that's what makes the system work again. Silence allows corruption to flourish. Silence, however, is a decision. Speak out if you see anything or know something. Because the truth always comes to light. Get more stories that reveal the unseen struggles for justice by subscribing.